and then we'll go through and we'll go, okay, this looks good. Oh, this piece here, maybe we should try this instead. And then we iterate upon that before we actually run it. Once we extract the data from that, we do the same thing again, right? So we'll iterate upon that based on the learnings. This is working and this isn't. We know that, so let's iterate upon it. Now we have new variations, and then we'll do that process again where we take a look at the new variations and we go, okay, well, maybe this should be this, or oh, that looks good, before we actually get it running.
Hi everyone, I'm Reza, and today I'm joined by Cory Dobbin from Boomn as part of a series of conversations we're having with media buyers to try and uncover the creative process and help media buyers navigate around that in paid advertising. So to kick things off, Cory, would love it if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Yeah, for sure. So currently I'm the VP of brand strategy with Boomn, which is a direct-to-consumer e-com marketing agency. So beyond just running paid social or SEM or anything like that individually, we are sort of like a full-service marketing agency. So we'll work with brands to help them resolve issues on their website, CRO, get them set up for SEO stuff, work on paid social, but really everything that I mentioned here is supported by creative, which we have a full creative team as well. So working with these brands, it's super important for us definitely to be constantly uncovering new creative, uncovering things about the creative that is running, that is working, what isn't working, and things like that. So a lot of different direct-to-consumer e-commerce brands, and fundamentally working pretty deeply on the creative side with all of them to sort of like feed all these different marketing efforts.
Yeah, cool. So in the past year, I've probably personally spoken to 100 or 200 media buyers in the industry, and the word creative just keeps coming up over and over again as something that's like super top of mind for everybody. And I was hoping that you'd be able to shed a little bit of light of, like, as someone who's been in the industry for a while, first of all, like, why do you think that is? Why do you think creative has become as important as it has as part of the media buying process? And then if you could talk a little bit about what does the workflow look like for your team with the media buying team and the creative team and the clients? How do you collaborate? How do new creatives get made? If you could kind of just talk about the workflow there between these different stakeholders and the iteration process, and anything that you can share around how that works, how that work gets done on your team.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess on the first piece there, creative is, I guess the way that I picture it, the reason that it's so important is that it is the face of your brand, right? Like, if it doesn't matter if you're running a prospected campaign or a retargeted campaign, this is what is communicating the messaging that you're trying to tell to the end user. So regardless of the campaign, it's what's telling the story that you want to tell. It's not, if you look at sort of like heat maps of how people engage with ads, it's the visual part first, then it's the copy. So you can really write anything you want in the copy, but the important part here is to get the creative right first and foremost. So I think that it's important not only because it's the first touch point for the end user, first or third, fourth, whatever. It also it's kind of like a universal language in a way for a lot of brands, where it doesn't matter the campaign you're running or the marketing channel you're on, or, are you running Google display, are you running Facebook ads, are you sending an email or SMS or something like that? It's all supported by creative. So the creative is in all of these different channels, sort of like, it has its own function in each channel too, right? It's specific to each channel, so you have to treat it specifically for each channel. So there's a lot of considerations that go into it. And I think that is sort of what makes it so important, is that you can't just like create one video and run it forever on all channels and it's going to work. It's an iterative process for each campaign, for each platform. So it gets really, really intense in terms of like the variations that you need in particular. But I think that that's why it's super important, because there's just the sheer volume of it that's necessary to properly communicate the message of a brand.
Got it. And so you kind of touched on it a little bit, and then what does that iteration process look like? What does the workflow look like? How do assume you're talking to other people in the industry who are trying to figure out how do they set up their process with regards to like working with the different stakeholders. What does that look like for you? What does it look like a day in the life of the team, or a weekly cadence that you might have? What does the process look like for your team?
Yeah, it's pretty dynamic, honestly. Like there's one workflow that we use quite often is we'll just have like a brainstorming session where we'll sort of like find maybe like an issue in communication that we want to resolve, and we sit down and we think, how do we do that? And then come up with different angles. From there, we'll sort of like write out different scripts that support that. We'll figure out, do we want this to be UGC? Do we want it to be testimonial? What type of creative do we want this to be, first and foremost? And then what's the messaging / script that we want to use within that? At that point, we'll probably have 10 variations of a piece of creative that we want to roll with, at which point we work with our creative team to, if we need to shoot new content to support it, find stuff in our archives that supports it, whatever, so that we can cut together the message that we're trying to tell specific for this. And then at that point, we'll get it running. An example, just paid social, we'll get some Instagram, Facebook ads running. Then we'll look at the data after running it for a while, see what that looks like, take from that some learnings, and then iterate upon that. So we know, this version of this ad worked, but this one didn't. What's the difference? Communicate that to the creative team and have them reiterate upon the version that was working, removing any of the elements that didn't.
Mm-hmm. And then how do decisions get made where obviously the media buying team is learning stuff, and they have data behind what they see is working and what's not. So when they go to the creative team with a lot of opinion and direction around where to go, but then the creative team is also like they're the creative team. They have an eye and a vision for making things look great. How do decisions get made? If there's ever any, like, I don't want to say like tension or conflict, but like differences of opinion between the final decision, how do those decisions get made? Is it just going back and forth until something is resolved, or how does that work?
It's kind of a balance. I think we are blessed at Boomn with a structure that works really well, where we all sort of just like kind of understand what the ultimate goal is, and it's very collaborative in that way. But I think fundamentally everyone's just looking at the data. You try and remove the emotional element from it. If the data says that this works and this doesn't, then that's what we're doing more of, basically. And then obviously there's considerations about brand guidelines and things like that, but fundamentally it's the data tells us the story.
Got it. And so let's talk about the data a little bit. How do you put that together? What do you look at? I know you guys use Motion. Would love to hear kind of reports you guys create there, how that fits into the uncovering of your data. How does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely Motion has helped with this. Saying that very transparently, not just because you'd like to hear that. It has helped us a lot, honestly. I've had a lot of positive feedback from the creative team as well, where before, we would probably use like a preview link from Facebook or something after like pulling some data into a report and looking through it ourselves, and then give the preview link to our creative team, and it's just a very cumbersome process. So having our creative team actually on Motion as well, so that we can walk through it together, screen sharing it if we need to, whatever. It's having that visual element has really helped sort of like clear up that story a lot. And I think that, so to give you some examples of like tests that I use Motion for, it's sort of like two parts. So there's the top ads or the top performance report that we use, where, as I mentioned before, usually when we come up with a concept that we script with or something like that, we'll create a bunch of different variations, and then we'll run those all as a test to see which variation works the best within this one concept or this one script. So being able to actually compare each of these ads with the performance report tool has been super useful for us, because we can, without considering the advanced features like the filtering and stuff like that, just from a top down, being able to see this is exactly what these ads look like. This is our spend versus our ROAS or something like that, right? So being able to have that visual element and tell that story when we're just looking at variations within a test has been super useful for us. The second part of that is the comparative analysis tool, which is something I've been going into a little bit more depth on recently, because a few different strategies, like for example, one client that I have in mind here has multiple product lines. One product line converts very well, but is a very little rev share compared to like our hero products, for example. So one of our goals currently is to try and increase its revenue share. We want to proactively try and scale this one product against the other ones to see if we can retain the conversion rates on that. So something that I've been using the comparative analysis tool for is, well, first of all, there's a strong consideration that you need to make for nomenclature in the account, right? Of which you have a pretty good resource on that. So we've gone through and made sure that we're labeling everything properly so that we can pull these reports, but pulling comparative analysis reports on each product line individually instead of individual pieces of creative. We're looking at maybe like all ads that contain car or something like that, right? Comparing it against all ads that contain truck. And then looking at those two product lines separately from one another. This is something that becomes really messy when you're looking at it in a dashboard in Facebook, right? And then excluding the fact that their reporting function is a little bit broken at the moment, that whole process is cumbersome on its own, exporting that into Excel or something and building it out into a way that's actually digestible. So I think that is the comparative analysis tool. That's something that I've been using a lot for recently, and it's been of great help to our team. Awesome.
And when it comes to actual data and KPIs, like do you just keep it simple and you're looking at spend and ROAS and like that? That gives you the most important signal that you're looking for? Or are you looking at other data points, other KPIs when you're evaluating creative and you're trying to make decisions about which to double down on? How do you think about the KPIs and what you actually look at?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of tricky because fundamentally ROAS is our magic number, right? We work in direct return performance, so ROAS is where we want to be looking. Obviously there's considerations to be made about metrics like click-through rate or something like that, but I mean, I've seen in many cases where there's a high click-through rate on an ad that has a lower ROAS than a different ad with a lower click-through rate, right? So it's definitely a fine balance, and I think that because of that, having the option to look at all these different metrics has been useful, because I do find at times that I'm turning ROAS off, I'm looking at our CPCs or something like that. But I would say most of the time I'm looking at, especially for, just as an example, the individual product line scaling that I was talking about, spend and ROAS combined, those two, comparing each product line with spend and ROAS has been useful, because then we can actually see how much we're spending on each product line and what it's contributing.
Cool, got it. For the last part, I just wanted to go back to the collaboration workflow a little bit more. When you collaborate with the creative team, it sounds like in your case it's a really kind of tight iteration process. Everybody has the same goal. That's really great to hear. How does the iteration process look like when a new piece of creative is being created? Like, is the media buying team involved in the steps in between? Like, okay, obviously you go to the creative team, you give some guidance on here's what I want to see more of, here's what we think is working. Or is the media buying team involved in the steps after that as well, where there's like a round one iteration, some commenting, or is it kind of you give the guidance and then they sort of do their thing, and then you take what comes out, run with it, and then learn from that and then feed it back into the feedback loop? Or do you have involvement in the steps in between as well?
Yeah, so it's the steps in between are definitely collaborative. So we have a system in place where we'll all sort of, before it gets approved by anyone, we'll all go in and we'll leave our notes on it basically and make sure everyone's happy. Because oftentimes, it's not, the creative team can't read my mind, for example, right? So if I give them a brief, oftentimes it's pretty functional, but it's not as creative as probably they would brief it as. So they would put it together the way that they interpret my brief, but maybe that's not exactly how I meant it, right? So we have a process where here's the ad, how we created it, what do you think, kind of thing, and then we'll go through and we'll go, okay, this looks good, oh, this piece here, maybe we should try this instead, and then we iterate upon that before we actually run it. Once we extract the data from that, we do the same thing again, right? So we'll iterate upon that based on the learnings. This is working and this isn't. We know that, so let's iterate upon it. Now we have new variations, and then we'll do that process again, where we take a look at the new variations and we go, okay, well, maybe this should be this, or oh, that looks good, before we actually get it running.
Yeah, and when you think of the role of a media buyer, like what you're describing sounds like the media buyer is very, very involved in the creative process. I imagine for some people that's been true for a long time. Like, has that been true for you? Like, have you been very involved in the creative process, like your entire career in media buying? Like, do you see that having evolved? How do you feel about the role of the media buyer with regards to creative, and has that been changing, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's always been really important, even from a freelancer working in paid media perspective. When I'm not a creative and I don't have a creative team to help an account where I'm freelancing under like paid social, running their Facebook ads or something like that, it's always been really important for me to communicate to the client that I'm working with the creative pieces, what is and isn't working. So I think it's always been, that piece has always really had to come from the media buyer in a way, because they're the ones that are seeing firsthand what isn't working. Anything beyond that is probably just anecdotal or just sort of like a gut feeling. The media buyer is the one that has the access to the data on the creative, and you'll find oftentimes too the creative that you think is going to work isn't the one that's working. So it's really the media buyer that sort of like brings that information to light. So yeah, I think it's definitely always been very much the media buyer that communicates this, especially from a freelance perspective. But even internally, now that we have a creative team, it's still the media buyer that's in there sharing a lot of the data and sort of like providing the guidance on that.
Yeah, cool. Well, this has been really great, Cory. Appreciate you sharing your expertise.